Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm excited to tell you a little bit about my summer project, which was developing species-specific management strategies for endangered plants, and it took place at the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park in Maryland. To give you a brief background about myself, my name is Vida Svahnstrom, and I just finished my undergraduate degree in evolutionary biology at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And this fall, I'm getting ready to start my master's degree in botany at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew in London. My research interests are broadly across plant biodiversity conservation, but I have a special interest and focus on rare plant conservation. This summer, I've had the pleasure of working at the C&O Canal National Historical Park in Maryland. C&O Canal is a bit of an unusually shaped national park, and that's because it extends 184.5 miles along the Potomac River on the Maryland side, including the adjacent historical canal. And most people probably associate this park with its history and recreation opportunities, but the park spans 4 physiographic provinces, which each have a distinct geology, and it preserves a major riparian corridor through the mid-Atlantic, and as a result contains an amazing diversity of habitats, including 11 globally rare plant communities, and the main subject of my program, a stunning 189 plant species that are listed as rare, threatened, or endangered in the state of Maryland. Throughout this presentation, I'll be referring to both state and globally rare plants, so I just want to clarify what that means. A globally rare plant is either G3 vulnerable, G2 imperiled, or G1 critically imperiled on this scale developed by NatureServe, and state rankings follow the same pattern but use the letter S instead of G. Most national parks focus their species-specific management on federally listed species, but according to the National Park Service Management Policies 2006, the National Park Service will inventory, monitor, and manage state and locally listed species in a manner similar to its treatment of federally listed species to the greatest extent possible. And state and locally threatened species are biologically important for a number of reasons. State listings often capture populations which are disjunct or at the periphery of a species range. Disjunct populations are widely separated from the rest of the populations for a species. As a result, they're often genetically distinct and can have novel evolutionary potential, which could be crucial for species adaptation in the face of climate change. An example in the park is Helianthus occidentalis, the western sunflower, which is a relatively common plant in Midwestern prairies, but it's notably disjunct in the Potomac Gorge, and as a result, it's quite rare here in the Mid-Atlantic. Populations at the edge or periphery of a species range are really crucial for migration, which once again is becoming increasingly important for species due to climate change. And one example here in the park is Quercus macrocarpa, the bur oak, which reaches the southern extent of its range in Maryland, where it's considered critically imperiled, although it's fairly common in the northeastern US and Canada. And not only are these disjunct and peripheral populations really important, they're also usually at a higher risk of local extinction than populations at the center of a species range, which increases their need for conservation. Finally, I also wanted to add that state-threatened species can be really important for local ecosystems, and their local extinction could negatively impact the overall health of these ecosystems, even if the species in question isn't at risk of extinction elsewhere. So there's been pretty intensive survey efforts in the park recently, and as a result, there's a fairly good understanding of the status of the 189 state-listed species in the park, and that provides an opportunity to develop species-specific management strategies for these plants. I've illustrated here some of the management activities that could be undertaken for a rare species. I'm just going to go through them from left to right, starting with deer fencing. The density of white-tailed deer in the park is currently so high that some rare species have been pretty much browsed into local extinction, and fencing can allow plants that are really palatable to deer to persist and flower and set seed. A lack of fire in the open conditions it promotes has caused really significant declines in some of the park's rarest species, and reinstating prescribed fire or mimicking it with manual removal of certain vegetation will be necessary to prevent succession in certain habitats and allow these species to persist. Invasive species are one of the biggest threats for many rare plants, and targeted removal of especially problematic exotic plants is going to be a high priority for some species in certain parts of the park. For plants which are cryptic and hard to identify or grow in areas that are hard to access, such as cliff faces, additional population monitoring is required so that we can learn more about how rare they are. Finally, for some rare plants, appropriate habitat might exist, but populations are still small and declining, and for some of these species, augmenting their populations or reintroducing them to an area where they once occurred via ex situ conservation can be an effective way to increase their population size and reproductive output. This final activity, reintroduction and augmentation, requires a lot of planning, research, and funding, and as a result, it was the focus of my summer project. The C&O Canal has partnered with the Mount Cuba Center, a botanic garden in Delaware with a focus on native plant conservation, to propagate their RTE species for reintroduction back into the park. Park staff will collect seed or other propagules from natural populations starting next year, 2022. Mount Cuba will propagate and grow these plants to maturity, and then the park will transplant mature plants back into their natural habitat in the park. So this is an outline of how I conducted my research this summer. The first step was to prioritize species for focused management. And to begin with, I prioritized based on state and global rankings, which I mentioned earlier, and this allowed me to take into account conservation need across different spatial scales. Once I had an initial list of high priority species, I also took into account additional factors like their local abundance or declines, both within the park and the broader region. Then I identified management needs for these high priority species and formulated feasible actions, some of which I introduced earlier. When population augmentation or reintroduction was identified as an appropriate action, I conducted further research which can guide this process, including creating propagation protocols and guidelines for propagule collection and outplanting. At each stage in this process, I used a combination of site visits and fieldwork within the park and extensive literature reviews of both the scientific and gray literature. And I also think it's important to mention that this was very much a nonlinear process. For instance, the detailed research I conducted in steps 2 and 3 frequently caused me to reshuffle my priority species in step 1. So now that I've outlined my objectives and my methods, I'd like to switch gears a little and tell you about some of the really amazing natural communities and associated rare species found in the park, as well as some of my management recommendations for them. Today, I'm going to focus on a particular section of the park, which is the incredibly biodiverse Potomac Gorge. This 15-mile section of the Potomac River is just upstream of Washington, D.C., located at the fall line between the erosion-resistant rocks of the Piedmont and the softer rocks of the coastal plains. And as a result of this meeting, the river falls 76 feet here at a series of fast-flowing rapids. The gorge experiences catastrophic flooding every few decades, which scours the bedrock and removes most of the vegetation. And this creates really unique and rare habitats, like bedrock terrace oak hickory forest on the left, which is considered a globally critically imperiled habitat, and riverside outcrop barrens on the right, which is considered globally imperiled. Both of these habitats support unique assemblages of plants, extremely high floristic diversity, and numerous rare species. Plants which live on the riverside outcrop barrens in the Potomac Gorge have to be able to grow in very thin, sandy soils, withstand harsh sun exposure, and either resist being washed away or be able to reestablish from seed following flooding. One of these species, and probably my favorite one in the park, is Peronicia Virginica variety Virginica, the yellow nailwort. This species is considered critically imperiled in Maryland, and it's rare throughout most of its range. In 1999, there were 65 known individuals here in the gorge, and now there's less than 5. From examining historical records in detail, it seems like this plant is highly intolerant of competition, and it needs flood events to remove its competitors. But with only 5 individuals remaining, the next flood could be too late. The population might be gone by then. By propagating and augmenting this population, we can increase its chances of survival until the next scour event. Right now, I don't believe any botanic gardens cultivate this species, so establishing an ex situ conservation collection and propagation protocols will also help provide a safety net for the species and source material for future restoration or reintroduction work. Another interesting plant I worked on this summer is Vitis rupestris, sometimes called the rock grape or the sand grape. This is a native grape species that's found in the same habitat as the yellow nailwort, flood-scoured rock outcrops, and sandy riverbanks. It's rare throughout its range, and the population in the Potomac Gorge is notably disjunct from the main stronghold for rock grape in the Ozarks. This plant is commonly used as rootstock in the viticulture industry because of its resistance to certain diseases, and so its important wild populations are conserved as potential future genetic resources. Unlike the yellow nailwort, rock grape seems to be quite stable in the gorge. It was first noted in the late 19th century here, and it seems to have persisted in the same area and maybe even the same spot since then. But genetic studies have found that it readily hybridizes with a co-occurring, much more common grape species, Vitis riparia, and seed set's very low. So combining these two factors, there's very little recruitment to the population. By propagating rock grape, we can increase the population size and add plants to the population away from the native Vitis riparia, thus decreasing the risk of hybridization. So if you all take one thing away from this presentation, I'd like it to be the idea that smaller urban national parks and urban nature reserves in general really do have an amazing capacity for conservation that I think often goes unappreciated. The C&O Canal National Historical Park not only protects but actively manages and restores species that are globally rare, alongside species which are really important components of the Maryland and DC flora but have been threatened here by extensive habitat loss and development. With that, I'd like to thank you all for listening today, and I'd especially like to thank my mentor, Andrew Landsman, my coworkers at the C&O Canal, Lane Strickler and Clara Thiel, and of course the SIP coordinators and staff, including Jessica Johnson, for making this all possible. Thank you.